Hello and welcome everyone. As was said, I am Catherine MacKeigan, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my dissertation research entitled Performing Public Policy. It's an institutional ethnography of the relationship between the government of Nova Scotia and the professional theatre sector. And first, before I go too far into this, I want to take this opportunity to thank my committee, Dr. Marguerite Cassin, Dr. Roberta Barker, and Dr. Lynn Turnbull, as well as our external examiner. Welcome, Dr. Sylvia Hale, and of course, Dr. Lynn Robinson and Dr. Isabel Smith. Thank you everyone for coming. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize that Dalhousie is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. Now, getting into the research and the meat of the presentation here, public funding for the arts is in part organized through routine administrative processes. These processes, well known and normalized through repetition, have been largely ignored and taken for granted in research and policy analysis. So through my research, I have established how these processes shape the work of theatre professionals and how that work is valued. So how did I do this? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you in this couple of slides. So first, looking at the background of the topic, the theatre sector and the provincial government exist in an institutionalized relationship. We can trace this back to Nova Scotia shores in 1606 with Marc Lescarbault's Le Théâtre de Neptune en la Nouvelle-France. And then we continue forwards. We can see again different relationships where at the Garrison Theatre we have soldiers performing theatre. But really looking at this century, we'll just jump straight into here. We're looking at the 20th century and we see in 1951, the Royal Commission on the National Development in Arts, Letters and Sciences, commonly called the Massey Commission, as Vincent Massey chaired the commission. So at this point, this commission was very much in support of and advocating for public support around theatre activity, amongst other arts, to build a national identity. And from this commission in 1957, an act of parliament formed the Canada Council for the Arts, our national arm's length funding agency. And this is important because arm's length here means that while the funding is coming from the government, the public support is coming from the government, it is at arm's length in terms of the decisions. How that funding is being allocated out is actually determined by a peer jury. And so after the Canada Council for the Arts was developed, then we started to see different provinces across Canada developing their own arts councils, including in 1995, the Nova Scotia Arts Council, here Nova Scotia's first arts council. In terms of public value, we understand that theatre, it's commonly understood to be and to provide a public good. A strong, vibrant arts sector, a vibrant theatre sector provides benefits to the region in terms of economic and social. Just a very quick list, we see it in placemaking, civil society contributions, community engagement, health, education benefits, regional development, even tourism and population attraction. So it really is important for the communities to have these vibrant art sectors, and therefore the public sector, the state, does provide public support to these for the public good outcome. So why is the theatre sector accessing these supports and why do they need them? Well, the theatre sector has limited revenue sources. It is a nonprofit sector that's really not commercially viable on its own. In terms of what commercial revenue there is, we can see slight revenue around box office revenue, ticket sales being bar sales, merchandise. We also have philanthropic and corporate giving from donors, sponsors, fundraising activities. But those two sources really, they're not sufficient and they have their own deficits to try to really make them sufficient and only exist off of that. So therefore, the theatre sector looks to the public sector. The theatre sector looks to government for support. And so this is where we have the public funding coming in. This is also where we have my research situated, in this gap. So little attention has really been paid to the institutional nature of the relationship. It's been very well chronicled. You can look at how the relationship has developed over the years in terms of theatre development, in terms of policy development. There's lots and lots of studies talking about these social and economic benefits, the need for the funding, but how is it actually used? How does it affect and influence the work? And so that's kind of the gap that I identified in the literature. And while I identified that gap in the literature, it really was my background in theater and in government and arts management that led me to this research. So in terms of a researcher's position here, it's a quick snapshot. You don't need to take the whole slide in, but I wanted to give you an idea of where I'm coming from in terms of my education, but also my work experience in the arts sector, sitting on peer juries, working for the government, working within academics and teaching on these topics. Now, during these roles, I was experiencing tension between the sectors, and that got me questioning and wondering what was going on. And I realized that that tension wasn't just me. My colleagues in all of the sectors were also experiencing these tensions, especially around cross-sector relations. So I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to kind of delve down and understand that better. Of course, there's always the kind of ongoing tensions around funding amounts and funding limitations, but it seemed deeper than that. There was more. And so that led me to my research problematic. The provincial government and the professional theatre sector in Nova Scotia exist in an institutional relationship, as I said, and this relationship is messy. And so I wanted to kind of go in and untangle it and really understand it. Where are these tensions coming from? What's controlling the activities? What's shaping the activities? So I asked kind of, if the provincial government offers public support to the professional theatre sector, how does the availability and the administration of that support shape the work of theatre professionals? So the research problematic is part of institutional ethnography. And this is what I adopted as my theoretical and methodological framework for this research. Dorothy Smith developed institutional ethnography as a process of inquiry to define power structures and ways of knowing. And there's three assumptions that I took from institutional ethnography and applied to this research. First being the everyday world as problematic. The ways of knowing are socially organized processes coordinated through everyday textually mediated experiences. Lived experiences hold implicit questions and tensions arising from their everyday organization. These experiential ways of knowing are often invisible or misrepresented within the ideological discourse. So what this means is the way that we understand and recognize where we are and our relationship to those around us and to the structures and the institutional structures around us are constructed through, or they're textually mediated by policy, by various documents. Even something as simple as, reading a newspaper article does kind of attribute some context to how you're understanding the world around you. Specifically within this context, we look at, applications and the guidelines around how do you access the public supports, and those start to shape theatre practitioners' experiences. Governing relations. Smith refers to the organization of everyday institutional processes as relations of ruling. There are dichotomous descriptions to the hierarchical roles where you're in a position of ruling or you are dependent. You are administering policy or you are accessing policy or the policy supports. So this position of authority is administering, as I said, over the institutional activities, responsible for coordinating the adherence of all participants to the governing discourse and the ideological ways of knowing. So to access policy, to access those supports, you need to shape the work to work within these governing relations, the expectations thereof. While Smith did call it ruling relations, I do call it governing relations, recognizing kind of the position of the state in governing and leading versus an authoritative figure. And final assumption is artist standpoint. Smith originally calls this the woman's standpoint, and later the people's standpoint, and I attribute it to the artist standpoint, situating the research at that level of the theater practitioner. Institutional ethnography recognizes individuals as experts in their own experience. So this standpoint is not a perspective, but an expert account of the experience from which the researcher, myself, enters into the investigation to kind of then spread out into the institutional frameworks to begin to understand and kind of unweave that problematic and understand what's going on. So how did I do that? Well, my interest was in discovering the consequences of everyday arts sector work experiences as impacted by the relationship between the Nova Scotia's provincial government and the region's professional theatre sector. And Smith here, I have a quote from Smith saying, "No map tells people how to move, but only how here and there are related on the ground should they want to get to one another." And that's really important for this research because it was very consciously not evaluative research. It was not prescriptive. It was exploratory, looking at creating an empirical map of the theater professionals' experiences so that we can really understand, okay, what is going on in this relationship? How is it being constructed? How are people navigating it? How are they understanding it? And then with this map, we can then use this map later in policy developments. My data came from 3 sources. Text refers to policy text, such as legislation, application forms, guidelines, plans, strategic plans. It also talks about texts from the organizations themselves that I spoke with, financial reports, annual reports, bylaws, etc. Observations, as you saw in my researcher's position, I'm actively involved within the theater sector. So I had some informal observations there, and I recognized them as a data source because I do recognize that those experiences attribute to how I know the world around me. And I do gain knowledge in that area and kind of gain observation as to what's going on. And again, that kind of talks back to those tensions that I was talking about, the experience ongoing tension. And then the meat of where my data came from was 34 interviews that I conducted over the summer 2015 with artistic creators, arts administrators and managers, who those 2 sections I combined to be theater professionals, and then provincial governing personnel. At the provincial governing personnel here, we're talking about government staff, but I'm also including any kind of subsidiary organizations such as Arts Nova Scotia or the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council, which I will get to later on, but those are volunteer roles, but they really are at that policy governing level. In terms of research design, again, so my data collection and data analysis ran in tandem. I began here at phase 1, really with the artist standpoint, and then I worked from the artist standpoint out into the institutional processes and the frameworks there to see what's going on. So I spoke first, as I said, with the artists, then I moved out to the administrators and management, and then out into public policy administration. At the same time, while I was doing this, I was actively questioning the data. What was it telling me? What was it directing me to go? Do I need more information in this area? Did someone refer to a peer adjudication, for example, which I need more data on? So then I'll go back into maybe phase 1 or phase 2 to get more information around the peer adjudication before I go over to begin mapping it. So in terms of findings, what I found was that we recognize C is activated by taking it up, by embedding it, by doing it. This is the administrative processes that theater practitioners and government are working within. And these administrative processes are really shaping the organization of institutional value, shaping how theater professionals understand their work, the value of their work, and how they attribute value within their work. How did I get there? Well, I began at the artist standpoint. Here we have a quote from Steve where he says he makes his living from performing in the arts in whatever form they come up. Similarly, Anton says, I make theater. So I had a lot of data around this idea that the artist standpoint is to make theater. That's the intention that they want. That is where they're doing it, what they're doing. However, it's not easy. Here we say Janice, while she was looking for roles, expecting to get them later in her career, she says, then I realized that was actually not true because the parts aren't there. Kelly Ann said she was forced to branch out and form a company. Similarly, Glenn said he started a theater company so he could work. So while I've established that the artist standpoint is to make theater, we also are establishing that to make theater, there is a need to have a company to develop that theater, to encase that theater experience, those productions. But I wasn't understanding why. I wanted to know more in this area. So why were they creating theater companies? What did that mean beyond, okay, we need money because theater production is costly, which led me into questioning the institutional framework that they were working within. As I said, theater costs money. That's why they're creating theater companies, because within a company structure, they can then access the government resources, the funding. The funding processes really were kind of recognized in 4 stages of enter, authorize, and summarize. Theater practitioners would access applications, complete them, submit them to the program officer, who would then then review them, determine whether or not they were sufficient, pass them on to the peers, the professional peers for adjudication. A funding decision was determined whether the work was validated to go forward and receive funding or not. And then if the theater professional accessed the funding and was successful following their work, they had to do some final reporting. So this was the basic framework. It's very linear, it's top-down, hierarchical, and it's very much focused on the application and the accountability of the application and how that kind of prescribes, or it's a prescriptive process. However, what I also found was, while it's administered in a linear process, the artist's standpoint was experiencing it as a cycle. And that was because of this area of summarize and enter. Theater professionals are economically dependent on public support ongoingly. So with the end of every public funding project, they then have to go and access additional funding. So they're perpetually kind of in this cycle. And that means that the experiences in this cycle really become ritualized as everyday normal experiences. They shape the ways of knowing how they're fitting their work within that institutional framework, which then led me to questions. So if that is the framework, who's administering it? And how does the theater sector understand their relationship to those who are administering? At this point, I moved out into the governing relations to find Arts Nova Scotia as our local arm's length funding agency. And you'll note that that's not the same Arts Council that we had in the beginning when I presented it. This is our second Arts Council. The Department of Cultures and Heritage, the culture division within that is kind of colloquially known as the bankers. I have a quote within my research where someone calls them the bankers. They are the ones who have the money, who then administer or allocate it out to Arts Nova Scotia for administration. And then the Nova Scotia Leadership Council, which is a volunteer council appointed to provide confidential recommendations to the minister on culture and creative sector policy. So these organizations, these governing relations, are all kind of close to, if not immediately within government, within state roles. And so their intention, their interest is to support the public good, albeit some of them also are a little bit farther so that they have more interest as well in supporting the arts. But at the end of the day, as governing bodies, the interest is in supporting the public good. However, the artist standpoint was experiencing this differently. We had perceptions or experiences of departmental subjectivity. While policy was supposed to be making sure things were accountable and transparent, and the processes were all followed, there were perceived subjectivity. There was also excessive institutional control that was perceived. This really came out of the issues around Arts Nova Scotia and the previous Arts Council, and then a lack of transparency around policy activity. So what does this mean? What it really means is that the governing ideology is not matched to the lived experiences of theater professionals. These administrative processes are really suffering from an insufficiency of language, where that insufficiency, theater professionals are struggling to explain and to fit their language within this larger governing discourse. And by having to tailor their work within that cycle, it really shapes their ways of knowing and doing. So those areas that are given value in their work. Those areas that are institutionally undervalued are undervalued in their work. So we see things like progressive company creations, but then an undervaluing of administrative work and the invisible work, as well as the concerns and challenges around really reporting on these public goods. And so just to sum here, in terms of a conclusion, though the shaping of theater professionals' work is an implication of the provincial policy coordination, the governing discourse is not inclusive of its occurrences or the subsequent consequences. Instead, the governing discourse overlooks that which falls outside of its scope. This finding opened the analysis to question the omitted experiences and how they were being overlooked. So I really showed, through this research, institutional ethnography as a viable research method to look at these experiences, giving attention and validation to the lived experiences of theater professionals accessing funding, as well as drawing out some of those policy externalities, the consequences of the unintended consequences of public policy. In terms of application, I can see this knowledge really being used in terms of recognizing the power dynamic that policy has and embeds and upholds, so that we can maybe shift the focus from the application back to the applicant, making sure that we have clear communications, clear priorities across the two sectors. And of course, with any research, there is limitations to this study. I also feel that these limitations really open up and lead towards future research. While this research, for example, is purposefully not evaluative or exhaustive, it does allow for a navigational platform to understand how arts and policy are interacting, so that we might be able to take this map and look at it in other disciplines and see, is this shaping of value there also kind of the same way? Is it occurring in the same way? As I said during the research earlier, peer adjudication and the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council were two areas that kind of are very important, but are also very confidential. And so there's not a lot known there. And so those areas, again, really deserve a study in and of themselves to get down into that knowledge. And in terms of timeliness and policy development, I really link that actually to my other bullet here on theatre practice, because policy, yes, policy is timely. It can change rapidly when it does change, but then it stays for quite a while, like policy developments that mean change. And so what I would hope to see, and what I would like to see now, is now that there is this I have this overview understanding of the intersection between policy and administration of arts. What happens when we understand now how value is being shaped? How is that value then coming down into the actual everyday theatre practice? How is it happening in the office spaces and in the administration and in the performance hall even? And that is my presentation. So I thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if you, just one moment, I'm going to stop the recording. If you would unshare your screen.